He signed the divorce papers with a fountain pen that caught the light like a small, indifferent blade. Outside, the city was being swallowed by a blizzard, snow over the glass, white noise on the skyline. Inside the 61st floor, the conference room smelled of polished mahogany and something cleaner, lemon oil maybe, or the antiseptic confidence of a building that had never learned to be humble. He put his name down, slow enough so I would see it, as if the act were a performance and not finality. He expected the scene to go the way he had scripted, a crisp signature, a nod, a shrug, and then a life resumed elsewhere, hotter air, different linens, Aspen for the weekend. He had no idea he was writing the beginning of a different story. If you're watching this from a city wrapped in snow, tell me in the comments. If you're somewhere warm, say that instead. Wherever you are, this one began with a pen and a storm. The judge spoke, and for a moment I thought he was offering the usual civility, practical words about assets, about decency. Judge Keats' voice had the kind of practiced neutrality that bend in the wrong places. It soothed like anesthetic, rather than cutting. Then he read the clause that changed everything. Victoria Vance's trust, the controlling interest in Obsidian Capital Partners, the stewardship of a $180 billion portfolio, transferred as a matter of settled instruction to the sole surviving heir, me. There was a small audible sound, someone's intake of breath, the soft rustle of paper. Dominic's jaw moved. The smirk eased, fracturing into an expression I had not seen him offer before. Surprise, quickly replaced by calculation. He was not an unpracticed man of feeling. He was practiced in the languages of entitlement and pivot. His eyes flicked to his phone as if to a map he could redraw. When you spend a life cataloging other people's affairs, you learn to notice the small signatures of intention, the way a man taps his watch when he is composing a lie, the way he folds his napkin when he thinks he is alone. Dominic had always thought I was a woman who cataloged the dead, a historian who preferred ledger books to lawsuits. He underestimated how well a historian understands inheritance, how legacies are not only remembered, but written and codified, how a single paragraph in a trust document can reroute an empire. He reached for a text to Bianca before the judge had finished pronouncing the transfer. The screen flashed, and I read it across his face without looking away. Aspen this weekend. Don't worry, this is nothing. We'll fix this. He thought he had time to fix everything. He had already mismeasured the room. The transfer did not feel like thunder. It felt like the low, logical clack of a hinge. The power dynamic in that polished room shifted quietly but irrevocably. Where he had expected dismissal, he encountered a patience so absolute it was unfamiliar. I did not stand, did not shout, did not ask for validation. I sat very still and cataloged what had been given to me. Responsibility, authority, a portfolio that could not be turned into a headline without consequence. There was no sweet satisfaction in his confusion. Instead, I sat with the arithmetic of consequences. I had not always borne my name publicly in corporate hallways. For years I had been an unremarked presence on the board, V. Moore, a quiet vote, a footnote on minutes. It was a particular kind of camouflage, less about deception than long strategic absence. I had preserved my mother's papers, her blueprints, her letters. There are inheritances that are only financial. There are legacies that are legal instruments and social commitments. And then there are those that are custodial promises. Victoria Vance had been all three. She had made her instructions precise, and in her precision, she had given me a tool. Dominic assumed I would be rattled into deal-making, into panic, into bargaining. He expected to leverage his influence before the board even knew how to form a question. He did not account for the historian's habits, the refusal to panic, the methodical numbering of facts. He did not know that I could be patient in the face of his momentum, and that patience was, in itself, a weapon. The difference between panic and plan is often only a clean desk and a willingness to sit through the quiet while others perform. He left the conference room that day with an expression like a man who smelled smoke and could not yet see the fire. He had a plan, and his plan involved two things I had seen before, a smear and a squeeze. He would use media and market pressure, the very things Obsidian managed for others, to make the trust look like a risk. He would bite at the board with well-placed leaks and confident half-truths. He would make my mother's legacy feel like liability, and he would be waiting to sell the idea back to the board as the only man who could stem the bleeding. I did not see the need to warn him that I had already anticipated those moves. Warnings are gift to a man who hopes to maintain control. Instead, I moved to neutralize the mechanisms he believed were his to command: PR, pockets of sympathetic executives, and the raw data that funneled the company's narratives into headlines. First, I called Kieran. He had the hands of an accountant who once liked to take watches apart. He was precise, and his curiosity looked like kindness. I asked for a quiet forensic review of key portfolios. Nothing reckless, nothing illegal, simply an audit with all the usual permissions we could assert as the new steward. Kieran arrived with a soft bag, a quiet seriousness that pleased me. He did not look surprised to be there. He had done this kind of tidy work before, numbers that hid in spreadsheets like secrets in books. Bianca was the other lover.
Dominion's PR chief, if you could call her that, though the title left out how she collected confidences and held them as currency, had become impatient with Dominic's escalations. She was young enough to think herself indispensable and old enough to carry a conscience. She presented herself to me as someone with an ache and a file. Well, to me. When she slid the flash drive across the table, she attempted a smile that was a question. I noticed the tiny fleck of ink on her wrist, the habit of someone who wrote things down to be sure she remembered them. "This is everything," she said. Not theatrically, simply, as if she were describing the weather. She had fear in her voice and a small, defiant honesty. She had already weighed the moral scale and found the tipping toward truth. The first forensic glance was visual. We did not immediately speak of numbers. We watched screens. Kieran had the monitors set up in Kieran's way: cool light, blue tint, the cascade of parenthetical details. The room felt like the inside of a watch mechanism, delicate, precise, and full of teeth that had to be aligned. Red columns appeared on the screen like bruises, occupancy rates that did not match tenant ledgers, lease lines that existed on accounts only as phantom tenants, revenue that had been folded away into holding accounts and then siphoned to shell entities. There were annotations, Dominic's initials on adjustment memos, an internal note with a draft board communication that smoothed over discrepancies. The numbers settled like settling dust, a 16% variance in reported occupancy for several flagship properties, an unexplained outflow that traced to a small convoy of transfers totaling $4.8 million. The math does not tell the whole story, but it is the backbone of accountability. $4.8 million is an amount that can be explained away as accounting error if you are a practiced liar and have prepared willful ignorance as a defense. It can also be the signature of a pattern. Patterns are what historians read for. I had my fingers steepled as Kieran navigated the spreadsheets, and the red columns lit up, and I listened for the pattern. The names on the notes lined up with entities Dominic had championed. The memos suggested preferential treatment, phantom leasing that bolstered occupancy rates, and those rates had been used to compute bonuses and to support share valuations that Dominic's office had benefited from. What the forensic work showed was not only that holes existed, but how they had been dressed for public eyes. Phantom leasing allowed management to show stability, even as cash flowed elsewhere. Misreported occupancy inflated the asset story. The corporation's press materials had been fed narratives produced from embellished metrics.
Dominic's hand, through memos and tracked changes, appeared not as some passing editor, but as the author of strategic obfuscation. There is a difference between catching a thief in the street and finding a systemic architecture that allows theft to be clinical. Dominic did not need to be flamboyantly greedy. His method was far more reliable. Build processes that could be nudged, and then nudge them when the time came. That is why the forensic audit mattered. It didn't just identify stolen amounts, it revealed the mechanisms that had made the taking plausible. At the same time, I was not seduced by the idea of public exposure for its own sake. There is a cruelty to spectacle. I wanted correction, not theater. There is also strategy in restraint. You don't demolish a house to evict a rat. You pull the wallboard, find the infestation, and then rebuild so the problem cannot return. For that reason, once the audit had given us the map, I focused on the legal instrument that could do the precise thing we needed without degrading the institution that my mother had spent a lifetime constructing. We found the Sterling Clause in a dusty subfolder labeled Comp Amend 2017. It was a short, clinical amendment to employment terms, ironically named for the man who drafted it. Dominic had been meticulous in his drafting. It tied severance and benefit protections to the integrity of reported company data, to the maintenance of ethical standards, and to an explicit forfeiture clause in cases of demonstrable manipulation of financial records. It used language Dominic loved: absolute, proportionate,
immutable when the facts indicated breach. In other words, he had written an instrument that, if the audit proved what it showed, would leave him without the golden parachute he had assumed would cushion any fall. There is a cold pleasure in ironies that do not require cruelty. He had authored the very measure that would, in effect, cut him off. He had built his own trap, and the trap had a name. We called the clause sterling in the reports, not because we wanted to be catty, but because precision helps to keep the mind clear. Dominic had always spoken of his work in terms of permanence and his own specialness. He had never imagined his own words would be folded back into consequence. Dominic responded as expected, first with bluster thinly disguised as negotiation, then with threats. He wanted to control the narrative. He wanted the board to accept a story that minimized both material and reputational loss. He waved imagined market instability at the board, suggested that even an internal probe could spook investors, and he offered a severance package in silence. He suggested, too, that if he were forced out publicly, he would leverage his contacts, a smear by slow drip, selective leaks, implied scandals. He believed markets could be bullied and reputations could be purchased.
I listened to him the way I would listen to a man reciting a line he had practiced in front of a mirror. There was no reason to match him with fury. Fury invites friends to a fight he has perfected. Instead, I prepared a room. I scheduled a board meeting he had not anticipated, not to shame him theatrically, but to present him with a very small, precise truth. Evidence, clause, consequences. I wanted inevitability, not improvisation. The boardroom was dimmed in a way that made projector light look like daylight. A clean, clinical slide sequence loaded, a series of balance sheets, occupancy charts, with the red columns Kieran had annotated, a single line that distilled the siphoned amounts, $4.8 million, into a number that could not be finessed into mere rounding error. At the end of the deck, placed there with care, were photocopies. Dominic's initials margin noted on memos, a tracked change draft, a scan of the sterling clause, with an unfortunately visible signature from Dominic's office, approving the amendatory language. He stood and tried to interrupt me when I began. That was perhaps his last miscalculation. He had imagined that his presence would tilt the room back into his orbit. He did not understand that his presence was evidence. He tried to charm the executives with a performance of wounded dignity, but charm is a fragile currency in a room that has been shown its own reflection in truth. "Serena," he said, leaned toward me with a mercantile smile. "There are reputational considerations. There are better ways than this." He called for legal review. He asked for more time. He offered to resign under terms, to release a prepared statement, to accept a divorce from Obsidian upon terms we all would be advised to accept. He tried to bifurcate his personal maneuverings from the company's fiduciary reality. He seemed to believe that he could decouple his own hand from the ledger lines that bore his initials. I let the room listen to Kieran. He spoke in the language of an analyst, clear sentences, short pauses, the quiet confidence of someone with numbers in order. He explained the 16% discrepancy in occupancy across key properties, the systemic adjustments that had been made to the books, the transfers that could be traced to shell accounts, and the accompanying memos. He did not speculate about motive. He mapped facts. The board watched screens where red columns became a negative space, holes where trust had been assumed to be whole. Then I turned the slide to the sterling clause. I did not raise my voice. I described what the clause did and how it had been answered by the evidence. Dominic's face closed like a book. You could see it in the way his shoulders shifted. A man prepared to bargain was a man who still believed in purchase. A man who understood he had miscalculated was the sleeker, meaner version. This was not the latter yet. He still hoped to find the right word to make people look away.
He offered the severance in the room, as if generosity might reframe his stewardship as magnanimity. "We can structure this," he suggested, to the shock of no one. "We can agree on terms that protect Obsidian and me." "It is not a question of structure," I said, and felt the room tilt when I said we. "It is a question of accountability. You drafted the instrument that governs this conduct, Dominic. Your words define the consequences." He lunged in small ways, points of technicality that pretended to be facts. Legal counsel rose, considered, then realized the paperwork was clear. The clause was triggered by the demonstrated manipulation of financial reporting. The audit showed that manipulation. The board could have 1,000 reasons to delay, public confidence, market expectations, but those are arguments of risk mitigation, not of contradiction to the documented evidence. He turned to the room, and that is when his arrogance reached for a last gambit. He suggested that to proceed without a full external investigation would be imprudent. He suggested that a drawn-out, expensive process might be required to separate shining persona from tarnished ledger. He tried to buy time with process. He did not know we had already done the collecting. Board members looked at one another, and it was there, a moment where institution and stewardship intersected. Some loved the idea of a neat resolution. Others feared the headline. The chair, who had been a diligent friend of Dominic's for years, spoke last. She had been careful, cautious, and believed in people the way some historians believe in artifacts. They must be handled tenderly or become useless. She palmed the clause copy, her expression registering the tilt of scale. Then Dominic's face changed. Not in the way that comes when a man repents, in the more dangerous way that comes when the equation he has controlled flips to unknown variables. He reached under the table and produced a paper, an offer. It was generous seeming, as if gilded charity could cover ledger entries. He asked for silence in exchange for a clean exit. He proposed a mutual release that would permit him to depart with an agreed sum and a confidential separation statement. There was a cleaner path still, to activate the clause and follow the legal consequence as the documents demanded. That would be the lesson, gently administered, that one cannot write a law for the world and then presume to be exempt from it. I did not want a spectacle. I wanted the integrity of the institution to be restored with the dignity of someone willing to accept the consequences of his own words. We voted. The board voted to accept the clause's implication. Dominic's proposal was formally rejected. A security officer, not in a cartoonish show of force, but as a sober necessity, stepped forward to escort him from the premises. There was no dramatic shouting. There were no raised voices from me.
Dominic was asked to leave. He was given the dignity that procedural correctness affords. His face registered something like disbelief, then a brittle animal escape of loss. He pulled his coat in a way that said he had expected different weather. As he was led out, he looked back, and for a single, almost private instant, his eyes found mine. Maybe he saw the thing he had always failed to see, a woman quietly, inexorably willing to be accountable, and therefore dangerous in a way he had never calculated. Then the doors closed, and the room exhaled. After he was escorted out, the calls began. Investors, counsel, market watchers. There was a steadier class of attention than I had expected, voices that wanted to understand how the leadership transition would be conducted, what safeguards would be put in place, and what the implications were for Obsidian's existing contracts. I answered in the precision of someone who had been given a ledger and a promise. We would conduct a forensic cleanup, tighten rather than tear, and create clearer reporting structures. We would not become reactionary. We would become accountable. There were choices I could have made then that would have satiated a darker impulse. I could have turned the matter into something that would read like a morality tale in the press. Banners, theatrical condemnations, gleeful revels in his downfall. I could have published names, leaked details, made his life a cautionary spectacle. That kind of revenge has its pleasures. It also creates new vacancies. Where cruelty becomes the currency, the institution itself is impoverished. I wanted something else: correction, restoration, and a permanent clarification that ownership carries responsibility. So I did what Victoria had always done when she faced something that was broken. I framed what was recoverable. The original blueprints of the old Vance holdings, inked plans for buildings that had been erected for a purpose beyond profit, went into a simple frame. The blue paper crackled in the light when I did it. There is a quiet joy in the domestication of preservation. Where Dominic had tried to recast property as numbers to be bent, I wanted to restore the original purpose: stewardship, urban design, and service. Framing the document was not theatrical. It was a declaration of intent. People asked whether I had ever wanted the portfolio. Did I crave the power? The answer is more complicated. There is a difference between desire and duty. I had loved museums and books and the patient work of keeping histories legible. When the trust was offered to me by a woman who had built an empire and made the rules coherent, my first response was not hunger, but measure. The portfolio is heavy with consequences. It demands stewardship, not spectacle. It insists on someone who understands the difference between asset and artifact. There is a kind of victory that has the texture of a ledger balancing.
It was not cathartic in the way tabloids think a fall should be. It was not personal vindictiveness. It was instead a refusal to let an institutional practice continue because of one man's bold appetite. Justice, for me, was clarity, a clarified ledger, a clarified mission, and perhaps above all, the reintroduction of humility to halls that had become arrogant. Bianca's choice to hand over the files became a turning point for her career. She had thought herself indispensable to a man who would discard her when useful. In stepping away, she opened herself to consequence and an opportunity for candor. She left Obsidian, opted to collaborate with oversight directors, and sought work that did not require her to be a conduit of convenient narratives. Kieran continued in his role, quietly admired for the day he had chosen to reveal the truth. He would keep doing the small, exacting work that stops rot from progressing into collapse. I did not make Dominic a parable. I retained the dignity of the company and the dignity of his exit. He would have to answer to other processes and time. An activated clause does not mean immediate criminality. It means that the institution has the right to preserve itself first. The rest would unfold in ordinary legal channels, where consequences are not the stuff of headlines, but of meticulous procedure. In the weeks that followed, I walked through properties that mattered to our tenants. I walked through lobbies and listened to concierges talk of small things like the bread they bought for their children and the way the winter felt in a heating system gone wrong. The empire, $180 billion, does not feel like a single thing. It feels like many small things stacked and coded in financial instruments, was also the sum of living details. My mother had loved the idea that stewardship begins with attention to the particular and extends into policy. I tried to remember that when the press asked about control and power. Dominic's last move had been to imagine himself indispensable and to write a clause that would save him when he needed it. The irony was not cruel, it was just true. He had misunderstood the instrument he created. Sometimes we write rules for others because we assume we will be exempt, and those rules, immutable in their language, will not bend to accommodate our preferences. That is the lesson of governance. It must be impartial if it is to be trusted. In private, there were days when I felt the weight of the ledger in my bones. It is not glamorous to be responsible. The night I received the trust transfer, I did not celebrate. I cataloged, I filed, I made lists, I read minutes. There is an asceticism to stewardship that displeases novels, but sustains cities. My mother taught me that legacy is not a bank balance. It is a promise to the future. Money is how institutions keep their promises, but money itself cannot be the promise. People asked me where revenge fit into my sense of justice.
I do not mistake measured correction for revenge. The world does not need spectacles. It needs institutions that can resist being gamed. It needs people who will read the fine paragraph. If there is a moral here, it is not that arrogance receives punishment, because arrogance sometimes goes unpunished, but that those who design systems must be subject to the systems they impose. Dominic's own hand had drafted a rule that would hold him to account. That is not poetic justice so much as good governance doing its quiet work. There were practical matters, of course. Investors wanted a timeline. Management wanted guidance. The press wanted a narrative. I answered with the modesty of someone who knows the difference between hype and maintenance. We initiated audits, restructured reporting, and began the patient work of remediation. There were reputational consequences. There were legal processes. There were personal reckonings. There were also people whose lives had contingently depended on things Dominic had distorted. They received fairer accounting and a measure of the clarity a good ledger provides. In quieter moments, I thought of the framed blueprint again. There is a comfort in placing a thing in a frame, not to transform it into museum spectacle, but to signal its worth and to protect it. I put the blueprint in a modest frame and placed it where the light would catch the ink. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder. The work of stewardship is not performed for applause. It is performed to ensure there are things left for the next steward to receive intact. When colleagues called me chair for the first time in a board context, I heard something in their voices that was new. There was respect, yes, but more important was the sense that we had avoided a catastrophe through method and not melodrama. Obsidian would not collapse because one man misjudged the scale of his own hubris. He would not be humiliated on the front pages because humiliation rarely repairs harm. He would be held accountable by the structures he had helped to shape. That, to me, was adequate. There is a peculiar freedom in walking away from the impulse to make suffering theatrical. When I saw Dominic one last time, a small, quick exchange as he left the building for good, he looked older than I had expected. Not older in years, but older in experience. He had that particular pallor that comes not from shock, but from the slow realization that the world is indifferent to the narratives you assign to it. He had assumed that his narrative would always be the dominant one. That assumption had cost him. Back at my desk, I opened a folder of personal correspondences Victoria left. Letters to me, to the board, to the institution that had been her life. She had written pragmatic notes about preservation, about buildings as civic trust, about how an empire's true wealth lay in its capacity to be useful.
Remember, she had written in a hand that still trembled with vigor, we are stewards, not proprietors. The instructions steadied me in ways that were not rhetorical. It was a code. I do not imagine I have finished learning the lessons of stewardship. There will be other tests, other men who think they can rewrite rules while exempting themselves, other temptations to use the machinery of the firm for personal advantage. But the blizzard that day, white paint on the windows, remains a clear moment, a world reduced to simple contrasts, ink and snow, signatures on paper that decide lives. That day the ink had been decisive, but only because there had been a prepared strategy to read it. If there is a private note to leave in the margins of this story, it is this: do not underestimate a quiet competence. Underestimation is a popular currency. It buys people arrogance and a mistaken freedom to act without horizon. Quiet competence, by contrast, knows how to project patience into action. It knows how to gather evidence and then use the institutional instruments available without spectacle. It refuses to perform moral superiority and instead opts for structural clarity. When I stood before the team that would continue to steward Obsidian, I spoke plainly. I did not promise triumph. I did not promise drama. I promised diligence, transparency, and courage. Those are not flashy virtues. They are practical ones. They will not draw a headline every day, but they will keep the promise my mother made, that the holdings would be used faithfully. In the weeks after Dominic's departure, there were articles that tried to cast the story as a morality play. Some made me an avenging figure, others made me a cold technocrat. Neither was accurate. I had no desire to be an icon. I had inherited a responsibility and a ledger. I held them with the same care with which I had handled my mother's books when I was a child. The soft care of fingertips on edges, the attention to preservation, the knowledge that hands will someday follow. The last time I went to the framed blueprint, I opened a small tab in the lower right corner. It had a notation, Victoria's handwriting, about a garden plan on the 4th floor of a mixed-use property. She had written about the possibility of a small public space in a dense block of towers. I took a mental note to pursue it. It was a tiny thing, perhaps even impractical in an empire measured in billions, yet it was precisely the sort of small thing that, if preserved, would make the difference between property and public good. The empire could have been a prize he took and then lost. Instead, the transfer of stewardship turned its trajectory toward maintenance. That is not a romantic ending. It is a workmanlike one. It is a story about how a woman who preferred archives to headlines can, when given a trust, choose continuity over spectacle. I still carry an awareness of being underestimated.
I have worn it like a shawl, soft, frequently handy. When I walk boards and read minutes now, I do so with the knowledge that my mother saw long past the next dividend. She wanted the buildings to breathe. She wanted Obsidian to be less of an instrument of personal aggrandizement and more of a public vehicle. We have work to do to restore that aim, to configure reporting, to make the red columns pale into balance, to keep the phantom leases from creeping back. It will be tedious. It will be necessary. Sometimes people ask whether I regret not making Dominic's fall grander. My answer is this: I regret nothing about preserving the institution's dignity. I regret nothing in refusing to convert consequence into entertainment. There is a difference between justice and spectacle. I prefer the former. It accomplishes, in the language of stewardship, what the latter cannot: long-term repair. If you have been underestimated in your life,
I want you to remember a practical thing. A quiet patience is a kind of strategy. It does not always offer immediate indication, but it offers a structure for it. Gather facts, build clarity, use the instruments at hand, and when you must, hold the paper up and let the words you are given do the work for you. There are nights I still wake thinking of ink and snow. Ink is small in its immediacy. Snow is indifferent. Between them lies the work we all must do, deciding whether to keep what we have inherited, and if we do keep it, to what purpose. I chose purpose. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever had a quiet competence that someone assumed was nothing, leave a comment about what you've built, or a moment when you were underestimated. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about small kinds of power and the ways they rearrange the world. Share this with someone who knows what it is to steward, rather than simply possess. We returned the framed blueprint to its place in the office, and every morning when the light caught the ink, I thought of my mother's hand, the way she mapped possibilities onto paper. Legacy is not an inheritance you claim with a signature. It is a promise you keep with steady work. That afternoon in the blizzard, he had signed the papers thinking it was an ending. He had not realized he was handing me the ledger, and with it the responsibility to keep what mattered.